Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Navarra, Spain. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the quiet years following the Second Carlist War, the village of Arbizu sat beneath the misted slopes of the Urbasa Mountains. Its stone houses leaned toward one another like aging confidants, and its church, Santa Lucia de los Vientos, was older than any birth record still legible in the town hall. Few outsiders came through then. The roads were poor, the nights long, and the confessions whispered through the lattice of the church often carried more fear than sin. It was in that silence that Father Esteban Menday arrived in 1867. A man of 35, with an austere face and eyes that did not easily rest. He came reportedly from Pamplona after a clerical reassignment due to exhaustion. That was the phrase signed by the diocesan notary, Father A. Salcedo. No one asked further. The war had left scars across both men and parchment. The rectory he took was attached to the church itself. 2 low rooms, a dry cellar, and a narrow courtyard where the former priest had once kept hens. From the first week, villagers noticed Esteban's habit of walking at night toward the old cemetery on the hill behind the church. He carried a lantern and what appeared to be a prayer book wrapped in cloth. When asked, he said only that he prayed for those who had been buried without rites during the unrest. A few weeks later, a woodcutter named Iaki Ruiz reported hearing what sounded like a woman's voice near the same cemetery, soft as if repeating vows. His wife dismissed it as wind through the cypresses, yet he swore he saw candlelight move among the graves. The first real unease came after a local girl, Maria Urrucha, went missing returning from the mill. Her body was never found, but her rosary was discovered near the cemetery gate. The constable wrote in his 1868 report that the soil there seemed recently disturbed, yet without any sign of shoveling. When questioned, Father Esteban replied calmly that he had performed a private mass for the dead that same night, but refused to specify for whom. The townspeople, still haunted by the atrocities of the Carlist years, avoided pressing a priest too hard. The church, after all, had lost many of its own during the conflict. Some said it had taken to guarding its mysteries more fiercely than its altars. Yet by winter's end, rumors began to coil through Arbizu like frost that Father Esteban had not come alone, that a woman had been seen entering the rectory one stormy night, never to emerge again. By the spring of 1868, the air in Arbizu had grown heavy with whispers. The bells of Santa Lucia de los Vientos rang less frequently, and when they did, their tone seemed strained, as though rust had found its way into the bronze. The parishioners attended Mass dutifully, but many kept their eyes on the floor when Father Esteban raised the chalice. Old Martin Oyarzun, the sacristan, was the first to speak of the strange preparations made in the church after sunset. He told his nephew, who later repeated it under oath before the municipal magistrate, that the priest often requested the church keys long after curfew. Inside, Martin claimed, Esteban arranged the pews in a semicircle and draped black linen over the altar. He heard murmuring, not Latin, not Spanish, and once the low weeping of a woman. What troubled him most was a coffin that had been brought from the ossuary one night and left near the apse. When he dared ask its purpose, Father Esteban dismissed him, saying, "The dead have as much right to witness the sacraments as the living." By midsummer, villagers noted that the priest's garden had been transformed. Where once there were weeds and chicken bones, there now stood a single white cross made of stone, around it freshly turned soil. Children who passed the rectory whispered that the cross shifted its shadow even at noon. A visiting merchant from Pamplona, Don Jacobo Lertsundi, later testified that he saw the priest walking arm in arm with what he believed was a veiled woman through the graveyard on the night of August 12th. Her gait was slow, he wrote in his diary, as though her feet did not fully touch the earth. When he inquired at the inn the next morning who she might be, the innkeeper's wife only crossed herself and said, "You did not see a woman, sir. You saw his promise. The diocesan registry from that year contains a curious entry, one that historians still debate. It records a marriage license, authorized under exceptional dispensation between Father Esteban Mendiay and an unnamed bride listed only as Maria del Silencio. No surname, no dowry, no witnesses. When a local curate from neighboring Itzari, Aranats questioned the document's validity, the office of the bishop in Pamplona reportedly sealed the page, marking it Privado, Correspondentia Ecclesiastica. That seal, stamped with the insignia still used since the years of the Second Carlist War, remains in diocesan archives to this day, though the corresponding record of dispensation has long disappeared. By autumn, the villagers began avoiding the church entirely. Marriages and baptisms were moved to nearby parishes. One stormy evening, lightning struck the belfry, yet no one claimed to have seen fire. The next morning, the bell ropes were found severed, and muddy footprints led from the nave toward the cemetery path. When Constable Arezabalaga finally entered the rectory, he found the main room stripped bare except for two things: a torn page from the Book of Common Prayer, and a lock of long black hair pressed between its lines. Father Esteban was nowhere to be found. For nearly 3 months after Father Esteban's disappearance, Arbizu existed in a kind of half-silence, the kind that settles after an argument the villagers pretend never happened. The rectory door was nailed shut, the windows boarded, and yet those who lived near the cemetery claimed to see faint lamplight from within at odd hours. Constable Arezabalaga, uneasy about reopening the matter, wrote a brief report for the Prefecture of Navarra in early 1869. The document, preserved in brittle ink, states only, the parish priest, Esteban Mendia, absented himself from duty under conditions incompatible with canonical conduct. Grave irregularities suspected. No exhumations authorized. It was signed reluctantly by the sub-prefect himself. But irregularities could not be buried so easily. In May of that year, 2 shepherds found remnants of a tattered wedding veil tangled among the roots of an old cypress near the cemetery's northern wall. The fabric, though yellowed by weather, bore traces of embroidery, the initials, M.U., stitched in white thread. Locals remembered that name, Maria Urrutia, the missing mill girl whose rosary had been found months earlier. An inquest was quietly opened by a provincial magistrate from Estella, Don Laureano Lassa. He arrived discreetly, posing as a church appraiser. Town records note that his investigation lasted 11 days, during which he interviewed residents, searched the church grounds, and examined parish ledgers. He noted several anomalies, the most chilling being that the registry of funerals for 1867-68 contained an unnumbered entry written in Esteban's hand: "Union sanctified under the eyes of heaven, though flesh be cold and earth unyielding." What disturbed Laureano further was the absence of any burial record for a Maria del Silencio, despite the earlier diocesan mention. When he pressed the bishop's office for clarification, correspondence abruptly ceased. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to Zaragoza. His final private note, recovered decades later from his estate, read, "The Church prefers silence over truth." And silence, in Navarra, grows like ivy over stone. Around that same time, several witnesses described hearing the church organ at night, though no one had permission to enter. The tones were uneven, halting, as though someone unfamiliar with the keys was testing them. A local child, Inés Mendizabal, swore she saw a figure dressed in black kneeling before the altar, veil trailing along the floor, motionless for hours. Her mother forbade her from speaking of it again. By the winter of 1869, Arbizu's fear hardened into ritual avoidance. Families began taking longer routes to avoid passing the cemetery. Hunters refused to track game near the hill. The last mass, held in Santa Lucia de los Vientos, was attended by only 6 people, all of whom later testified that the church felt colder inside than the frost outside. Then came the discovery that reopened every wound. During repairs to the rectory roof, a mason dislodged a loose tile, revealing a small cavity beneath the eaves. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to Maria. The paper was fragile, but the ink legible. "I have done what the church forbade, but heaven witnessed." Tonight you are no longer apart from me. They will not understand that vows can bind even through death." The handwriting matched that of Father Esteban. The envelope passed from hand to hand until it reached the alcalde, Don Tiburcio Lariategui, who read it aloud in the town hall with shaking fingers. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon the villagers could remember. A vote was taken that evening, the kind whispered rather than spoken, to reopen the church crypt, despite the diocese's earlier refusal. The exhumation took place under a dim, cold moon. Only 4 men attended: the alcalde, Constable Arrazabalaga, the mason who had found the letter, and old Martin Oyarzun, who had once served as the sacristan. They pried open the floorstones near the altar where the priest had often lingered after Mass. Beneath the flagstones lay a narrow cavity lined with decayed wood, the remnants of a coffin. Inside was the unmistakable form of a woman's body, preserved beyond reason. Her dress, though centuries out of fashion, was bridal white. Around her neck hung a rosary missing 1 bead. The alcalde's record from that night describes the scene in restrained phrases: no wounds visible, no decay, countenance serene, lips pale as if kissed. Martin fainted upon recognizing the embroidery on the bodice, the same initials M.U. A second object was recovered from beneath the woman's folded hands, a gold ring engraved E.M. on the inner band. The alcalde, fearing scandal, ordered that both the ring and the remains be reinterred by dawn, and that no mention of the event appear in the official minutes. But human restraint falters easily before superstition. Word spread across Arbizu within hours. By week's end, the rectory walls were defaced with chalk crosses. Children refused to attend catechism. The bishop's envoy arrived days later, a Jesuit named Father Quintin Alzaga, dispatched from Pamplona to restore ecclesiastical order. His demeanor, witnesses said, was not inquisitorial but wary, as though he had seen this pattern before. He examined the letter, the coffin site, and the parish records, then ordered all related documents to be sealed and transported under escort to the diocesan archive. Before leaving, he told the alcalde quietly, "Do not call this blasphemy. Call it grief that forgot its bounds." That summer, a fire consumed part of the rectory. Some claimed lightning, others a candle left burning. When villagers arrived, the flames had already reduced the structure to embers. Only the church stood intact, its door ajar, the nave filled with smoke, and the faint odor of incense. No human remains were found, only the melted outline of a brass crucifix fused into the stone. In September of 1870, a traveler from Burgos, seeking shelter, reported finding a hermit living in the nearby hills. The man identified himself as Brother Esteban. He was described as gaunt, trembling, yet his eyes were clear and fixed upon something no one else could see. The traveler's account, published later in a local gazette, noted that Esteban spent his nights lighting candles for his bride, who sleeps but is not gone. After that mention, he vanished again, as though the earth had reclaimed its secret. In the following years, the people of Arbizu learned to speak of the affair only in euphemisms. Children were warned not to play near La Colina de la Novia Dormida, the hill of the sleeping bride. Farmers avoided plowing too close to the churchyard wall, and travelers who paused at the tavern were told that the wind sometimes carried a woman's laugh from the direction of Santa Lucia de los Vientos. By 1872, the parish had fallen under the administration of a new curate, Father Julian S. Daba, a soft-spoken man from Logrogo who kept meticulous records. His first entry in the parish log acknowledged the deteriorated condition of the sanctuary and the absence of proper ecclesiastical instruments. Among the items noted missing were 2 silver chalices, a marriage registry from 1867, and 1 small reliquary of uncertain origin. The previous priest's name was not mentioned. Around this time, the region was again disturbed by political turmoil. Skirmishes from the Second Carlist War had left scattered militias wandering the mountains, and churches once more became shelters or hiding places for deserters. In one of Father Julian's surviving letters, preserved at the Diocesan Archive in Pamplona, he writes, "The soldiers fear the chapel more than the gunfire. They claim a woman in white stands among the tombs each night of the full moon. I tell them it is superstition, yet even I have felt a chill when saying Mass before dawn. That winter, a series of small earthquakes shook the valley, dislodging stones from the cemetery wall. During the repairs, workers uncovered a narrow underground passage sealed with lime. It appeared to connect the church cellar to the older, forgotten section of the crypt. When opened, the air that escaped was stale, but oddly perfumed, like wilted lilies. Inside, the masons found fragments of broken glass, a candle holder, and a single piece of parchment bearing half a sentence in Esteban's handwriting. Well, till the final bell joins heaven and soil. Father Julian ordered the passage resealed and posted a guard during the night for the next month. The guard, Miguel Arraiz, later testified that he twice heard footsteps beneath the floorboards and what sounded like a door closing softly. No one came out, he swore, but I left my post before dawn. Whatever was moving down there wanted no company. By the spring of 1873, vegetation had begun reclaiming the churchyard. Ivy crawled up the belfry, covering the cracks where lightning had once struck. The parishioners who still attended services said the walls sweated salt on humid days, and that the scent of lilies returned whenever the Gospel of Marriage was read aloud. An attempt was made to repaint the interior frescoes, scenes of Saint Lucy, patron of the church. But beneath the old plaster, the workers found a hidden mural, a man in priestly robes holding hands with a veiled bride whose face was entirely faded. Above them, in Latin script, the fragment of a verse, Et mortuos ego copulavi, and the dead I have joined. The bishop's office ordered the wall covered again immediately. The mural was plastered over within a day, but the memory of it clung to the workers like the smell of lime on their hands. One of them, Pedro Larraz, refused to return to the site. He claimed that while scraping the old paint, he had heard a sigh from inside the wall. Not echo, not draft, but breath. His companion laughed until, that same evening, Pedro's wife found him praying outside the church, face askant, insisting that the plaster still moved softly as if breathing. Father Julian, who had tried to maintain reason amidst the growing unease, began to keep a private notebook. Only fragments survive, but one passage from late 1873 stands out. I believe Father Esteban's transgression was not madness but devotion distorted. He sought to prove that love consecrated by faith could conquer the grave. Yet I fear he succeeded too well, and now cannot rest. A brief mention of Arbizu appeared in a Pamplona newspaper that same year, under a column of rural curiosities. It spoke of a haunted parish whose priest wed death herself. The diocese, alarmed, issued a statement denying the existence of any such records and dismissed the report as anti-clerical propaganda. A familiar echo of the Second Carlist War, when rumor and religion had danced too closely together. But silence could not still the night sounds. Villagers spoke of hearing the faint chiming of bells, though the belfry ropes had long been removed. On certain fog-bound mornings, footprints appeared on the church steps, one set of heavy boots, and beside them, the lighter, smaller prints of bare feet. No one dared follow them. In the spring of 1874, a traveling scholar named Dr. Evaristo Goyeneche, a lecturer from the University of Zaragoza, visited the region collecting folklore for a paper on post-war superstition. His journal records an interview with an elderly woman identified only as Señora Mendizabal. She told him, "The priest loved a girl who died before her vows. He dressed her in white, placed a ring on her hand, and said the Mass himself. When he kissed her, her lips were cold, but her eyes opened once. He thought it a miracle, but it was only the last air leaving her lungs." Dr. Goyeneche's report, filed in 1875, is the last surviving academic mention of the case during that century. He concluded, cautiously, whether hysteria, grief, or the residue of an older pagan rite, the event at Arbizu reveals the thin line between faith and delusion. The church hides such wounds not from malice but from shame. After his departure, Santa Lucia de los Vientos was officially deconsecrated. The bells were removed, the altar stripped, and the keys turned over to the provincial authority. But those who lived nearby said that even locked, the church remained awake. Light still flickered through its cracks on stormy nights, and the scent of lilies lingered in the air long after any human presence had gone. In the years that followed the deconsecration, the story of Santa Lucia de los Vientos sank into the folds of memory, not erased, but avoided. By 1876, only shepherds and stray pilgrims passed through the valley. The church roof began to cave in under the weight of moss and rain, yet the cross atop its steeple remained untouched, gleaming faintly in the morning light like an unspoken oath. The provincial office transferred ownership of the property to the Order of St. Camillus, who used it briefly as a refuge for aging priests. Among them was Father Nicholas Borda, who left behind a thin, water-stained ledger. In it he described the first night he spent in the ruined rectory. There was a perfume, faint but persistent, lilies, always lilies. At midnight, the door opened by itself. I heard footsteps descending to the cellar. When I followed, I found only a single candle burning before a wall where mortar had been freshly disturbed. Borda stayed barely 2 weeks before requesting reassignment. His report was never filed publicly, but a copy found decades later in Pamplona's diocesan archives bears the marginal note, "Matter closed, not for spiritual instruction." During these years, the region was still struggling with the political aftershocks of the Second Carlist War. Many displaced clerics wandered Navarra, carrying with them tales that blurred into parable. Yet even among the superstitions of that turbulent era, the case of the corpse bride priest persisted with unusual precision. Letters from nearby villages reference it obliquely, a cautionary tale told to novices about the danger of loving beyond God's allowance. Then, in 1881, a landslide cut off the road leading to Arbizu for nearly a season. When the path was cleared, workers reported finding bones, not human, but arranged in a deliberate pattern, at the edge of the cemetery wall. Some believed they were the remains of animals sacrificed in old Basque rituals. Others whispered that Father Esteban had tried to build himself a new congregation beneath the ground. In 1883, a small band of seminarians visited the site under the guidance of Professor Santiago Aldave, who taught ecclesiastical history in Vitoria. His private letters, later discovered in the university's archive, recount an experience that left even his rational mind unsettled. As we approached the ruins, the air grew heavy with the scent of wax and earth. Inside, the nave was silent, yet when I spoke, it echoed twice, once as my voice, and again in a softer tone, like a repetition by someone unseen. We left before sunset. One student claimed to have seen a veil flutter in the apse, though there was no wind. After that visit, Aldave abandoned his planned paper on forbidden rites of rural Spain. He wrote instead to a colleague in Madrid, "I believe the story of Father Esteban was not about death, but the refusal of time. The church may forget him, but the soil remembers." By the close of that decade, the ruins of Santa Lucia de los Vientos were sealed for the last time. Yet even sealed, it was said that the stones wept when it rained. Thin trails of moisture descending the Fas aid like tears over an unconfessed sin. By 1885, the village of Arbizu had shrunk to half its former size. Families moved toward the rail lines, seeking work and a life untouched by the shadow of the old church. Those who remained kept their doors bolted after dusk, and the children grew up hearing two kinds of bedtime prayers. One for the living, one whispered for the restless dead. That same year, a local archivist named Clara Godi, working under commission from the provincial council, arrived to catalog abandoned religious properties across Navarra. Her diary, now preserved in the Pamplona Historical Collection, devotes several pages to Santa Lucia de los Vientos. She describes approaching the church through dense morning fog. The silence was not absence but presence. The grass near the threshold had grown in a perfect circle, as though trodden by unseen feet. Inside, the altar was cracked, and the walls seemed to breathe. I felt observed, though no living soul was there. In one corner of the sacristy, Clara found a box of rotted paper tied with black cord. Inside were fragments of correspondence written in a delicate hand, all unsigned, all addressed to my beloved Esteban. The last note read, if God forbids what the heart commands, then he is no longer my confessor. Wait for me when the bells fall silent. Shaken, Clara requested local assistance to transfer the materials to Pamplona. None of the villagers volunteered. The alcalde at the time, Don Basilio Echevarria, refused even to sign the requisition form, claiming that what sleeps there must not be carried away. She eventually arranged transport herself, but by the time the papers reached the provincial office, the box was nearly empty. The letters reduced to pulp by a sudden rainstorm on the road. Only the final line, written in smeared ink, was still legible. We are one flesh, though earth divides. A few months later, strange phenomena began again in Arbizu. Travelers reported lights moving across the hillside at night, always in pairs, like lanterns carried side by side. Shepherds heard faint choral singing from the direction of the church, even though its door remained chained shut. On several mornings the lock was found rusted open, yet no footprints marked the mud around it. Clara, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and guilt, returned one last time in 1886. In her final diary entry she noted, "The lilies grow even in winter here. They sprout between stones and graves as though nourished by prayer. I left a single candle on the altar for those who loved too deeply to rest." She fell ill soon after her return to Pamplona and died within a month. Her belongings were inventoried. Among them was a wedding band, gold worn thin, inscribed with the initials EM. From that point onward, even the diocese stopped referencing the parish by name. Maps of Navarra gradually omitted it. Near the forest edge labeled simply Rabbit Abandoned. In the winter of 1891, nearly 20 years after the priest's disappearance, an aging monk named Brother Matteo Laurien arrived at the Monasterio de Arash, seeking absolution. His health was failing, his speech slurred, and his nights haunted by visions that left him trembling. What he confessed in fragments that December night would later be transcribed by a novice and sealed under ecclesiastical confidentiality. The record surfaced only in 1962, when the Vatican began cataloging forgotten disciplinary cases from the late 19th century. Matteo's testimony described his youth as a sacristan at Santa Lucia de los Vientos. He served under Father Esteban Morales, the priest accused of heresy and necromancy. Matteo swore he had loved and revered Esteban, like a saint, until he saw what he called the second wedding. According to the document, after the death of the young woman known as Lukai Aranburu, Esteban refused to perform her burial. He sealed her coffin within the church, claiming she would rise on the third dawn. On the night of that third day, Matteo returned to find the priest dressed in ceremonial vestments, the altar draped in white linen, and the coffin open. Inside, the girl's face had been adorned with a bridal veil, her hands clasping a rosary of black glass. He spoke to her as though she lived. Matteo's statement reads, "He recited the vows, and I heard two voices answer, his and something beneath the veil. The candles trembled, and the crucifix turned upon its cord as if in refusal." The monk described how Esteban then placed a ring on the corpse's finger, kissed her lips, and declared their union eternal before God. In that moment, the church bells began to toll by themselves, 13 times. Though no one had touched the rope, the air filled with the scent of lilies and decay. Panicked, Matteo fled the church, but claimed that when he turned back, the door had already closed behind him. He never saw Esteban again. Weeks later, the church was found deserted, the altar cracked, and both bodies, priest and bride, missing. Years later, haunted by guilt, Matteo joined a monastery under a false name, carrying the ring he had taken from the altar as proof of what he'd witnessed. He kept it until his death, when it was placed in a small reliquary box sealed by the Vatican. The box's inscription, still visible today, bears 3 words in Latin, corpus non dormiet, so the body does not sleep. Locals say that in Arbizu, when the wind cuts through the valley on winter nights, the old church bells still sound, faintly and always 13 times. By 1897, The village of Arbizu had nearly forgotten the precise details of Father Esteban's deeds. Yet the church of Santa Lucia de los Vientos remained a silent sentinel. Its roof had collapsed in several places, but the walls stood stubbornly amid creeping ivy. Children dared not pass its threshold, and even shepherds avoided grazing near the cemetery hill, claiming the soil hummed at night. That year, an ambitious diocesan historian, Don Federico Ascona, petitioned to catalog the abandoned parish. He was allowed limited access, but with strict supervision and under the instruction that no records of the findings were to be published. His journal notes that the crypt beneath the altar had been sealed with a thick slab of stone and layers of lime. The air was fetid, he wrote, yet strangely sweet like dried flowers in a tomb. Ascona described discovering scattered fragments of letters and a single silver ring engraved EM, the same initials that had appeared in prior reports. No human remains were present, but soil disturbances suggested something had once been buried there and later removed. He observed cracks along the wall that revealed faint traces of candle wax and sawdust, as though the chamber had been used repeatedly for clandestine rituals. By 1900, local folklore had begun to solidify into story rather than memory. Travelers passing through Navarra reported strange lights along the hill, describing them as a priest walking hand in hand with a bride whose feet never touched the earth. Shepherds swore they heard faint chanting at midnight. Even the priests of neighboring parishes whispered of Santa Lucia de los Vientos, cautioning novices. Do not linger near that hill, for vows can linger longer than the living. In 1902, an ethnographer from Pamplona, Cide Orida Rosario Mendieta, visited Arbizu to collect regional folklore. She recorded several accounts of objects vanishing from local homes. Crucifixes, rosaries, and small rings, always returned weeks later without explanation. The villagers insisted the items had been borrowed by those who dwell beyond the grave, and traced the origin to the long-abandoned rectory. Mendieta noted the parallels to the Second Carlist War era, when secrecy and rumor intertwined, leaving communities suspicious of every shadow. Her journal also recounts an encounter with an elderly shepherd, Julio Uranga, who claimed to have followed a figure in black along the cemetery hill during a moonless night. Julio described the figure kneeling before a small stone cross, raising a hand to bless the earth. When Julio approached, the figure vanished into the mist, leaving behind only a faint fragrance of lilies and damp soil. The same year, a small portion of the church's ruins collapsed, revealing a narrow passage beneath the altar, previously sealed by mortar. Those who peeked inside saw remnants of charred candles and broken glass, but no bodies. Rumors began to spread that the crypt had been emptied by Father Esteban himself, though no documents corroborated this. By the turn of the century, Arbizu had transformed into a village that tolerated the past but did not engage it. The church ruins were avoided, the cemetery walked around, and whispers of the corpse, bride-priest, were told in hushed tones during winter evenings by firesides. Yet the memory persisted. The soil, the ivy-covered walls, and the occasional scent of lilies held the secret, as if the land itself remembered. Between 1904 and 1908, Arbizu experienced a series of minor but unsettling disappearances. None received official notice, yet the accounts survived in parish diaries, letters, and sporadic municipal reports. In each instance, the missing individuals had passed near Santa Lucia de los Vientos, often at dusk or during mist-heavy mornings. The first noted case was a traveling musician, Don Alicio Marquez, who arrived in 1904 to perform at a festival in a neighboring village. Witnesses reported seeing him pause at the edge of the cemetery hill, staring intently toward the church ruins. Hours later, he vanished. His instrument was found propped against a tree, strings still humming faintly in the wind. No search party ever found him. Later that year, a local woman, Rosa Echeverria, reported seeing what she described as a man and a woman walking hand in hand through the misted graveyard. She swore the woman's dress was bridal white and that the man wore the robes of a priest. Rosa told neighbors she felt an icy presence following her home for days afterward. She refused to leave her house alone for several weeks. Records of these incidents appear sporadically in the municipal ledger, often written as cautionary notes by the alcalde rather than formal complaints. One entry from 1905 reads, "The church ruins at Santa Luca de los Vientos continue to inspire fear. Citizens are advised against travel after nightfall. Several have vanished without trace." A visiting historian, Dr. Ignacio Laraya, noted in his diary that the local population attributed the disappearances to Father Esteban's continued influence. According to villagers, he had mastered a ritual to bind a soul to a corpse, granting it mobility under certain nights, particularly near the full moon. Dr. Laraya recorded the stories without judgment, writing, "Whether superstition or residue of trauma from the Carlist conflicts, the narrative is consistent across multiple, unrelated sources." In 1906, a shepherd named Sebastian Olazabal claimed he discovered fresh footprints leading from the church ruins to the outer boundary of the cemetery. The footprints appeared to belong to two people, one heavy and shod, one light and barefoot. Yet, when followed, they ended abruptly on the hillside as though vanishing into air. Sebastian refused to report the finding, fearing ridicule, but mentioned it decades later to ethnographers. By 1908, the stories coalesced into a local legend. Father Esteban had not died, but had joined eternally with his bride, wandering the church grounds unseen, still performing rites that no living priest dared attempt. Families living near the hill altered their routines, avoiding paths that would take them past the church after sunset. Even in these final documented years, the village did not feel safe enough to fully restore or demolish the ruins. The memory persisted, in whispered warnings, the occasional appearance of white lights along the cemetery hill, and the faint scent of lilies drifting on the wind. It was as if the land itself refused to release the past. Interest in Arbizu's church ruins had drawn a small number of researchers, drawn not by folklore alone, but by the tantalizing fragments of documentation preserved in the diocesan archives of Pamplona. Among them was Professor Manuel Godi, an archivist and historian specializing in 19th century clerical anomalies. He had obtained permission to examine the sealed parish records and the private notebooks of Father Julian S. Daba, as well as surviving correspondence from Father Esteban's earlier tenure. Godi's notes describe pages filled with cryptic entries, references to vows beyond flesh, and meticulous observations of celestial alignments, particularly the moon's passage across the valley. One fragment suggested that Esteban believed certain nights conferred power over the threshold between life and death. Another referenced the Second Carlist War, hinting that wartime chaos had provided cover for his unusual rituals, a detail Godi found consistent with local oral histories. In February 1910, Godi discovered what he described as the most unsettling artifact, a small journal bound in black leather left behind in the rectory's collapsed attic. It bore the initials EM on the cover. The entries, dated 1867 to 1869, combined prayers, personal reflections, and detailed instructions for preparing the ceremonial rites, some describing how a deceased bride should be dressed, kissed, and bound in spirit to her priest. What particularly disturbed Godi was the final entry, "When the world forgets us, we shall continue. I take my leave, but our vows are sealed beyond sight. The lilies witness, the soil remembers. The living need not intervene." He also noted that several passages referenced the Second Carlist War as both a cover and a symbolic foundation. A war that allowed the living to distrust the dead, and the church to trust in secrecy above transparency. While Godi attempted to reconcile the journal with historical records, he realized that much of the church's documentation, including the marriage license and burial records, had been removed or destroyed. In some cases, witnesses reported that papers vanished from municipal offices overnight, a pattern suggesting deliberate concealment. By mid-1910, Godi's research concluded with the somber acknowledgement that the case could never be fully reconstructed. He reported that some parishioners still avoided the church hill entirely, claiming that the lingering presence of Esteban and his bride could be felt during twilight and on foggy nights. Even decades later, locals would recount seeing shadows passing through the ruins, small lights flickering along the cracked stone floors, and the faint scent of lilies carried on the wind. The professor left Arbizu quietly, leaving the journal and his notes with a trusted colleague in Pamplona. The ruins, partially collapsed and overgrown, remained a place neither entered nor destroyed. Its stories persisted as a cautionary whisper, a memory of vows that outlived both life and canonical law. By 1911 and 1915, the story of Father Esteban and his bride transformed from documented anomaly into folklore. Arbizu's villagers began speaking of Santa Lucia de los Vientos less as a church and more as a threshold, a place where vows, once broken by death, refused to stay silent. Farmers told travelers that at dusk, two figures could sometimes be seen near the cemetery walls. A tall priest in black robes and a woman in white, always walking hand in hand. Hikers who crossed the hill reported that the air grew inexplicably cold, and that the scent of lilies would drift ahead of them, as if guiding, or warning, their passage. One elderly woman, Doga Ramona Echeverria, recounted that her grandfather had once hidden a child from the duo after dark. She told ethnographers in 1912. He swore he saw a priest kneel before a grave and speak softly, and the girl's lips moved too, though she had not spoken a word. He never slept a full night again. The local tavern keeper, Sigor Andres Urrucha, noted that travelers who mentioned the ruins in conversation would often fall silent afterward, speaking of headaches, cold sweats, or the sudden impression of being watched. He began to mark their stories in a ledger under the heading, Warnings from the Hill. By 1913, the legend had permeated even nearby towns. Reports of lights moving in pairs, inexplicable sounds from the direction of the cemetery, and fleeting glimpses of veiled figures were common enough that authorities quietly discouraged travelers from lingering. Some priests warned that the case was evidence of spiritual attachment beyond death, while others insisted it was simple superstition amplified by generations of silence. The Second Carlist War, though long over, provided a historical lens for these accounts. Elders said that the chaos of the conflict had allowed for secret rites to occur unchecked, and that the land itself seemed marked by the memory of these events. The parish's obscured records and lost documents only fueled the idea that something forbidden had taken root, immune to both time and authority. In 1914, a traveling journalist, Don Javier Olano, visited Arbizu for an article on rural superstition. He described walking near the church ruins just before nightfall and feeling a sudden chill, followed by a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone repeating vows beneath the earth. His published account stirred interest in the region, but met with official silence. By 1915, the ruined church had become a symbol in local culture, a sight to be avoided, yet whispered about in cautionary tales. Weddings, baptisms, and burials in the village incorporated subtle references to respecting the dead, perhaps as a communal acknowledgement that some vows, once made, could linger far beyond their intended boundaries. Even decades later, researchers noted that the hill maintained an unusual aura. No permanent structure could fully contain it, and those who stayed near the ruins reported recurring visions, faint lights, or the inexplicable fragrance of lilies in the evening air. Between 1916 and 1919, Arbizu saw a resurgence of unusual reports surrounding the ruins of Santa Lucia de los Vientos. Hikers and travelers passing through the valley occasionally left brief accounts in personal journals, noting phenomena that defied easy explanation. These were often dismissed by local authorities as exaggeration or the result of fatigue, yet the consistency of the reports drew the attention of folklorists. One entry from 1916, penned by Miguel Iribarren, a cartographer mapping Navarra's rural trails, described his experience walking past the church at dusk. I saw two figures, one tall in black and another smaller in white, moving along the cemetery hill. Their forms were translucent yet distinct, and though the wind did not stir, Their garments flowed as if caught by a gentle breeze. I approached, but they vanished before I could speak. In 1917, a group of shepherds claimed to have found a series of small footprints near the church ruins, one set of heavy boots and one of bare feet, leading toward the collapsed belfry and stopping abruptly at the altar. These footprints bore no mud from the surrounding earth, as if the figures had hovered above the ground. An elderly woman, Duda Felisa Mendizabal, recounted that her late mother had warned her never to cross the hill after nightfall. On a foggy night in 1918, Felisa reported hearing faint singing, a single candle flickering at the far edge of the cemetery, and the soft chime of a bell, even though the ropes had long been removed. She described the sound as too precise to be wind, too sorrowful to be joy. Travelers' letters from the period often remarked upon the recurring scent of lilies near the ruins, despite no visible flowers. Botanists later suggested the scent could be attributed to wild plants, yet locals insisted that it carried a form of intentionality, a reminder of those who remained bound by vows beyond death. In 1919, Professor Ignacio Laraya, who had previously studied Navarra folklore, returned to the valley to conduct interviews. He documented at least 10 independent accounts describing the same phenomena: pairs of lights, fleeting figures in black and white, and inexplicable scents. Laraya concluded that while physical evidence was minimal, the consistency of witness testimony suggested that the cultural memory of Father Esteban's rites had left an enduring imprint on both land and consciousness. These accounts solidified the narrative in local culture. The priest who had married a corpse was not merely a story of the past, but a persistent presence. Even decades after the initial events, the ruins of Santa Lucia de los Vientos remained a place to be observed from a distance, respected. Between 1920 and 1923, interest in Santa Lucia de los Vientos resurfaced in more formal channels. The Diocese of Pamplona, concerned about the growing local folklore, commissioned a discreet review of the church ruins and all associated records. This effort was led by Canon José Arrieta, who had previously served in administrative roles across Navarra. Arrieta's notes, preserved in a partially redacted archive, reveal a methodical investigation. He reviewed parish ledgers, municipal correspondences, and surviving letters from Father Esteban's brief tenure. He noted the repeated references to unusual ceremonies, missing documentation, and witness testimonies describing the priest's ceremonial union with the deceased. The canon described some accounts as credible within the limits of human perception, while remaining cautious not to speculate beyond the written evidence. Around the same time, Professor Santiago Aldave, returning to the valley to conduct ethnographic research, observed the church ruins during early morning hours. His field notes record unusual phenomena: the faint odor of lilies lingering over fallen stone, echoes resembling two voices repeating phrases in Latin, and small lights that moved in patterns suggestive of human figures, yet with no visible occupants. Aldave compared these findings to folklore from other regions, but noted that Arbizu's case was unique for its consistency and persistence across decades. Canon Arrieta also documented the condition of the sealed crypt beneath the altar. Though no bodies were present, the passageway showed signs of earlier disturbances: trampled soil, traces of wax, and fragments of paper with faint Latin inscriptions, some partially legible, referencing vows and union beyond death. He concluded that while direct evidence of ritual activity was limited, the physical traces corresponded with multiple eyewitness accounts. By 1923, a small number of academic papers began to circulate within regional historical circles. Scholars debated whether the phenomena were psychological, spiritual, or a complex mixture of both. Many referenced the Second Carlist War as an indirect factor, noting that chaos, secrecy, and displacement may have created conditions for both real and imagined ritualistic behavior. Yet even within the academic community, the tale of Father Esteban maintained a quiet air of unease. Locals continued to treat the ruins with caution. Children were still warned to avoid the hill. Travelers reported glimpses of figures moving at dusk, and the scent of lilies persisted in ways that could not be explained by flora alone. The story of the priest and his bride, once a scandal, had become a living memory embedded in the landscape of Arbizu, bridging history, folklore, and the unexplained. Between 1924 and 1928, Arbizu became quieter, but the legend of Santa Lucia de los Vientos endured through the recollections of older villagers and the scattered writings of curious travelers. Stories that once circulated as rumors gradually solidified into enduring local legend. The ruins remained largely untouched, nature reclaiming stone and mortar, yet the hill maintained its unnerving presence. An elderly former sacristan, Mateo Iribarren, recounted in 1925 that even decades after the events, he occasionally glimpsed a figure in black near the church, accompanied by a smaller figure in white. He claimed the pair seemed to move deliberately, never colliding with the fallen stones, as though they were walking on invisible paths. His account, recorded in a private letter to a Pamplona archivist, emphasized the eeriness of the air itself, which he described as heavy with the past, carrying whispers no one alive can fully hear. Local farmers continued to report unexplained phenomena during foggy mornings. Crops near the church were oddly stunted or twisted, while the rest of the fields flourished. Shepherds spoke of bells ringing softly where no belfry ropes remained, and some claimed the faint smell of lilies would precede the appearance of shadows at twilight. In 1926, see Orita Rosario Mendieta, revisiting her earlier ethnographic work, collected additional testimonies. Villagers described hearing chants, seeing lights hovering above the ruins, or finding small personal items such as rings or rosaries mysteriously left along the cemetery wall. These accounts frequently referenced Father Esteban's marriage to the deceased, framing it not only as scandalous but as a cautionary tale about love and devotion that exceeded the bounds of mortality. By 1927, historians began to cross-reference parish records with personal diaries, letters, and municipal documents. They noted recurring elements, the initials EM bridal attire, candles, and ritualistic gestures involving the deceased. Many concluded that while supernatural elements could not be verified, the cultural memory had preserved the events with unusual fidelity. Even children growing up during this period learned to respect the hill. Parents told them that the spirits of a priest and his bride wandered the ruins, watching over the church and its cemetery. Whispers of vows repeated after death were enough to ensure that few dared approach the site alone. By 1928, the church itself was nearly indistinguishable from the hillside. Ivy and moss consumed much of the stonework, while cracks in the walls allowed the wind to create low, haunting tones that some described as faint singing. Travelers, ethnographers, and local historians alike agreed that the church had become more than ruins. It was a vessel of memory, preserving the unsettling events of decades past. The presence of Father Esteban and his bride remained a quiet but persistent echo, woven into the fabric of Arbizu. Between 1929 and 1931. The final years of documented memory surrounding Santa Lucia de los Vientos were marked by reflection rather than fresh incidents. The village of Arbizu had grown smaller, its residents cautious and wary of the hill. Yet the tale of Father Esteban and his bride persisted, whispered among children, recounted in private letters, and occasionally noted by wandering scholars. In 1929, Professor Ignacio Laraya, now elderly, returned to the valley for a last observation. He walked the perimeter of the church ruins at twilight and recorded in his journal. The stones themselves seem to remember, shifting shadows where no light falls. The scent of lilies grows stronger at dusk, and the air carries a weight not easily described. The villagers call it the presence, and I cannot deny its reality. It is neither Holy Spirit nor holy memory, but something between. Other reports from the period included faint lights seen by passing travelers, whispers that carried across the valley at night, and fleeting glimpses of a black, robed figure and a smaller, white-clad companion. Ethnographers noted that even those who had never visited Arbizu often knew of the legend, suggesting its persistence through oral tradition alone. In 1930, an anonymous letter arrived at the diocesan archive in Pamplona. It described a man claiming to have found a partially buried journal belonging to Father Esteban, containing further notes on rituals, vows, and instructions for maintaining union beyond death. The letter's writer claimed the journal had been lost again after a storm. No further confirmation of its existence was ever made. The historian Don Federico Azcona, reviewing the accumulated records, concluded that the case of Father Esteban had never truly ended. While the priest and his bride were physically absent, their story persisted in the landscape, in local memory, and in the physical traces. The broken altar, the sealed crypt, the faint candle wax, and the flowers that inexplicably grew in winter. By 1931, the ruins were largely inaccessible due to overgrowth and partial collapse. Yet those who lived nearby claimed the hill continued to retain a peculiar gravity. Birds avoided the churchyard. Livestock hesitated near the perimeter, and the wind carried scents and sounds that defied explanation. The case of the priest who married a corpse remained unresolved, a story carefully preserved through decades of rumor, documentation, and first-hand testimony. Santa Luca de los Vientos became both a place and a memory, a reminder of vows that cannot be undone, of faith stretched beyond mortal limits, and of a legacy that whispers to anyone willing to listen. Even today, the hill stands quietly in the Navarra Valley, its ruins softened by moss and ivy, yet always watching, always remembered, and perhaps, just perhaps, still alive with echoes of that unholy union. Unholy. Translate in Spanish, but don't change text.